Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice program, How Things Work, the Legal Edition, which is a rapid response project that addresses how our civil rights are being impacted by actions being taken by the new administration. My name is Hunter Mallinger. I'm a second-year law student, vice president of the ASU chapter of the Native American Law Students Association and descendant of the Inupiaq people of Northwestern Alaska. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to this conversation. These videos are a unique opportunity to address what is happening in America today, to clarify any misinformation or disinformation being spread, and how civil rights and social justice advocates can act to protect the rights of everyone. Today's topic is Birthright Citizenship's impact on Native Americans, which is more critical than ever as we confront the Trump administration's Executive Order 14160 on birthright citizenship. It is essential to examine how these issues intersect with the principles of justice and equity that guide the work of our section and the ABA generally. I'm honored to introduce our speaker today. We are honored to have Professor Patty Ferguson-Bohnee with us today. She's a clinical professor of law, director of the Indian Legal Clinic, and faculty director of the Indian Legal Program at ASU. A dedicated leader in Indian law, voting rights, and tribal recognition, Professor Ferguson-Bohnee has testified before Congress and state legislatures, litigated on behalf of tribes across multiple courts, and serves as Arizona's Native Vote Election Protection Coordinator. We're grateful to have her deep expertise and commitment to justice for tribal communities. So without further ado, I'd like to dive in. Today, we're talking about President Trump's administrative action or Executive Order 14160, aiming to deny citizenship to children born in the U.S. if their mother was undocumented or temporarily present, and the father was not a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident. Before getting into the impact of this executive order, or how this executive order may impact Native Americans, I'd like to first ask a few questions for legal clarity. So first, Professor Ferguson-Bohnee, I'd like to ask, are Native Americans subject to U.S. immigration laws?
Thanks, Hunter, and thanks for agreeing to do this. So first of all, no, Native Americans are U.S. citizens, and they became U.S. citizens by statute and treaties. And so as a result, they're not subject to deportation or immigration enforcement.
Thank you, Professor. So as a follow-up and kind of setting that baseline, I'd also like to ask, what was the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, given that I don't have a great understanding myself of it, but I think it's worthwhile to kind of just set the context here.
Sure. So Native Americans were not all citizens before 1924. So Native Americans became citizens through statutes such as the Indian Allotment Act or through a treaty. And I think many of us know that Native Americans have served in higher numbers than any other race in our military. Specifically, World War I happened and Native Americans were serving in the U.S. military. And as a result of their service, there was this issue with, we have some Native people who are citizens, some who are non-citizens, and the president basically said at the time, we need to deal with this Indian problem. And to deal with that problem, the Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, declaring that all Native people born in the United States become citizens of the United States. And at the time, there was some tension because some Native people did not want to become citizens because they were citizens of their own tribes. With the Indian Citizenship Act, it recognized that tribal members remain citizens of their tribes, but they also become citizens of the United States. So at that time, in 1924, all Native people in the United States became United States citizens.
Thank you, Professor. And so I guess for the unfamiliar audience, leading up into the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, I guess it wasn't generally understood that Native Americans were indeed citizens of the US. And so I'd like to ask, specifically, there is a case out there called Elk versus Wilkins, and I was hoping that maybe you could maybe shed some light on what the meaning of Elk versus Wilkins was for Native Americans prior to the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924.
Yeah, so if we think back, we're going back in time, which is very important because Native Americans were members and are members of their tribes. And tribes are separate sovereigns in the United States. And this has been recognized in the Constitution, in case law, in statute, so in treaties. So all of this has recognized Native people and tribes as separate entities. So, in after the Civil War, which ended in 1865, there were a series of Reconstruction amendments, the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment basically provided that all former slaves became citizens, and then the 15th Amendment secured their rights to vote. And so it banned race-based voter qualifications. So this was in the 1865 that the Reconstruction Amendments passed. And then we have the Civil Rights Act of 1866 that also guaranteed that people born in the U.S. and not subject to foreign power, excluding Indians not taxed, are declared to be citizens of the United States. So this is happening at this time, but whenever those amendments were passed, they recognized that Native people, if they were not taxed, then they were not citizens of the United States. So that is in the Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, which is the reapportionment clause, that Native people weren't considered for basically what we call today reapportionment, that then results in redistricting for electing our Congress, our Congress people. But it wasn't even contemplated in the citizenship requirement, because at the time when they were debating, should we, include excluding Indians not taxed, basically the Congress said it wasn't necessary because they believed that Native Americans were subjects of the U.S. and not subjects to its jurisdiction, because they recognize that tribal people were citizens of their own tribes, and that was considered extra jurisdictional entities. So we're setting the stage that we're recognizing a very positive thing, that tribes are separate sovereigns. And there are treaty negotiations happening with tribes, that is being respected. But in 1880, you have a Native individual from the Winnebago Reservation who moved off the reservation, and he tried to register to vote. And his attempt to register was denied. He said, "I severed my tribal relationship. I have fully and completely surrendered myself to the jurisdiction of the United States." And he claimed that under the 14th Amendment that he was a citizen and that he was entitled to the rights and privileges, specifically the right to vote under the 15th Amendment. And what the Supreme Court said is that no, like Native people, you can't just decide that you are a U.S. citizen. You can only become a U.S. citizen through statute or some treaty. That Native Americans are akin to the children of ambassadors or other public ministers of foreign nations. They're born within the U.S. and therefore not considered born in the U.S. and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. So they can only become citizens through naturalization, through some treaty or statute. So the importance of Elk v. Wilkins is, one, it's recognizing tribal sovereignty, but it's also showing that Native people don't become citizens through the 14th Amendment.
Awesome. Thank you, Professor. So it sounds to me like, given that the Indian Citizenship Act has been passed, that it kind of brought Native Americans under that umbrella of citizenship under the 14th Amendment. And so I'd like to start getting into the impact that this has in combination with some of the administration's actions, and in particular, the executive order. So I would like to sort of ask you in the contemporary context here, first off, how is the administration using Elk v. versus Wilkins itself today, in light of the executive order that was issued?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question because it's raised a lot of confusion with regards to the status of Native people. Because in the responses to the challenges to this birthright citizenship order, the Department of Justice and their filings have referred to Elk v. Wilkins and other cases that predate the Indian Citizenship Act. Basically saying, look, in this case, it says that you can't just decide that you're going to become a citizen, totally ignoring the birthright citizenship portion of the 14th Amendment and why Native people were excluded. Native people were excluded because of the sovereign status of tribes within the United States. And so that has raised a little bit of confusion among tribal people. And in the newspapers where, in multiple filings, the Department of Justice has referred to Elk v. Wilkins, but hasn't gone further with regards to this other statute of treaty, which has been issued, which is the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act.
Thank you, Professor. One question that comes to mind, and one of my first initial thoughts in, reading some of DOJ's briefings was, can an executive order change the citizenship status of Native Americans?
Yeah, no. The Indian Citizenship Act was passed by Congress. So an executive order cannot change the law. The powers are limited to the executive with regards to that. They can do things in furtherance of the law. But Native Americans are citizens under the law, and that can't be changed through executive action. And there have been cases actually challenging the constitutionality of the Indian Citizenship Act, and those have all failed.
Thank you. That just wanted to clarify that point. And given what you've just said, in thinking of just the real world impact that, sort of what's some of the confusion that's been going on, have there been, to your knowledge, any actual cases out there of Native Americans being stopped and detained by ICE at all, or any other agents?
So with regards to this executive order, we have had some information that there were Native people who were detained and held. They weren't deported, but they were detained until they could prove their tribal citizenship. But in the past, we have had Native people who have been detained, questioning their citizenship status. And so that is very concerning for tribal people who are often racially profiled.
And, thinking of what, just to being able to empower somebody that may be subject to some of this of the administration's actions or agency actions, what can Native Americans do, or what knowledge would you impart on them if they were to indeed be detained or stopped by ICE?
Yeah, so because of racial profiling and where tribes are located, some are located in border areas and communities. Sometimes Native people, there is a possibility they could be stopped. And if they are stopped due to this racial profiling, or if they, if there's a misunderstanding of this legal status, all U.S. citizens have a right to assert their status as U.S. citizens and request to speak to an attorney. All U.S. citizens retain their constitutional rights, including the right to remain silent, their right to counsel, even during interactions with ICE. And while as a U.S. citizen, you do not have to carry identification to prove your citizenship, it could be wise to have that documentation, especially if you know that there are going to be, increased patrols and things of that nature. And specifically, you may want to have your tribal ID with you or a picture of your tribal ID.
Okay, so that I think that sort of answers the next question I have, but feel free to maybe expand on it. And because I know that, just from, my personal experience, especially working with you on things like, the Native Vote Project, that it's not like that uncommon for folks on the reservation to not have their ID on them, or an ID that is recognized at the polls, a birth certificate, or other typical forms of identification, on their person. So I was hoping that maybe you could elaborate on just what exactly they can do in a scenario where they don't have proper identification on them. And if you've already answered this, we can just move on, but hoping maybe you can expand on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, there are a large number of Native people who don't have ID. I mean, there's a large number of, Americans who don't have ID as well, but especially people from Native communities. There are a large number who don't have a birth certificate or other types of ID that may prove their citizenship that isn't a tribal ID. And some people have certificates of Indian blood, but they're 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper that they're not carrying around in their pocket. So, and not all Native people have phones, but if you have one, maybe take a picture of your certificate of degree of Indian blood or your tribal ID and know who to contact from your tribe in case you are detained to confirm your tribal status. And of course, you can also always assert that you're a citizen and assert your right to counsel to contact an attorney.
Thank you, Professor. I next wanted to maybe just localize the issue a little bit more. And I know that we're coming down to our time here, but I thinking of it, especially in the modern day, I'm wondering why this is sort of a concern now, especially under these Trump era policies, and maybe bring it home a little bit in our state of Arizona here. And what are some of the concerns that you might have on your radar on the local level?
Yeah, so whenever this order was issued, tribes in Arizona were concerned because there were reports of Native people being detained. And in Arizona, previously there was a law that was passed, it's referred to as SB 1070, which basically allowed the police to racially profile people. And at that time, Native people were detained. There were Native people who were deported. And so tribal leaders and citizens were concerned about how this may impact and target people of color and Native people who are often racially profiled.
Thank you. And maybe zooming it back out, I don't want to give you whiplash, but zooming it back out and just thinking of what the courts are trying to do to sort of stymie what the administration is doing now. Could a future court ruling throw this idea of Native American citizenship into question? Could that change the landscape in your view?
No, I mean, it's pretty clear there's a statute, natives are citizens, there's treaties, there's also case law that confirms that. So I don't think that's likely to change the status of Native people as citizens of the United States.
Great, thank you. And just as a final question here, if you have any legal resources that Native Americans, can access, or perhaps, if they're found in a situation where they're being detained or stopped, is there anything that comes to your mind that would be the right resource for them to go to immediately?
I mean, there's a number of organizations out there that provide resources. I would have them contact their tribes, legal aid offices, the ACLU offices, the Native American Rights Fund. All of those have resources and materials for tribal people.
Great, thank you, Professor Ferguson-Bohnee. I wanted to just show my appreciation for your time here. Far too short, in my opinion, but thank you so much for your invaluable insights and for grounding this conversation in both sort of the legal history and the lived experiences of Native communities. So what we've discussed today isn't just about constitutional law. It's about, who is seen, who is protected, and whose rights are at risk when political rhetoric turns into actual policy. To everyone who has joined us today, thank you so much for engaging in this urgent and necessary conversation. Native Americans are U.S. citizens, not because the 14th Amendment says so, but because Congress recognized their sovereignty and status through the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. Yet despite this legal certainty, we've seen that citizenship doesn't always translate to protection, especially for those most vulnerable to profiling, displacement, and misclassification. This moment calls for our vigilance, advocacy, and allyship. Please stay informed, support tribal communities, and ensure your clients and communities know their rights. And please join us in continuing this work through the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. You can learn more and get involved at ambar.org/CRSJ. Thank you again so much, and keep showing up for justice. Thank you all.
Thank you.